React is a library for creating a UI. It's utilizing both HTML and JavaScript. With it, you split your application into multiple components. In each component, you define a render function where you tell this component what do you render on the screen. You reference data that exists somewhere, either stateful or stateless. When you reference this data, you print it over the UI, again with the render function. If you use ES6, then you extend the React component. And this would be a component for you. So you have components, you have states, you have properties, you can reference other components. You use the JS6 language, which is a combination of HTML and JavaScript. And basically this is it. This is the React library, which we are going to read a little bit about from its documentation here, and see how do you use actually React. How do you define components? How do you refer to state? How do you refer to properties? How do you compose components? How do you refer to external components? We would assume no knowledge. We would assume that we are backend developers who have no understanding in UI, and therefore we are going to cover the basic code, the basic documentation from the React documentation website, from reactjs.org, see how to build the components, how to refer to state, how to compose components, and what are the best practices for building an application with React. React documentation says that it's declarative, component-based, and learn once, write anywhere. Let's check out what the documentation says about the declarative. About declarative, it's saying that React makes it painless to create interactive UIs. That sounds more like marketing stuff, but if so many people use and like it, it must be of something. Basically, what you do is that you create views. The views are the part that manage what the user actually sees. So, as opposed to Angular, which basically tells you, I want this folder structure, this is how you write your tests. And it imposes a new standardization, and it gives you all the routing, and this makes it great to work in large teams and multiple teams. So in React, you get the view part, you get the part where you write the sections, the components that are presented to the users. So if you want all the routing and all the debugging and conversion from HTML, because if the designer gives you HTML, how to write testing, then you would need basically to invent or find the libraries which are suitable for you, which is additional work. In general, additional libraries that we have are Flutter, which is great because it's based on Dart, which is a more sane language, and we also have Vue.js, and we have Svelte. So in React, you create your components based on the documentation. You focus on a component, and you declare how it connects with the data. So you say, this is my component, and the basic way you say that you declare a component is class hello message extends react.component. So we are creating a class in JavaScript that is named hello message, and it extends react.component. And what we have in this class, we need to implement the function render. So in the class hello world extends react.component, then function render, then return div hello, and in curly braces this.props.name. Close the div, close the class. So we have just declared a React simple component. As you see, we have seen used the JavaScript language. Inside it, we implemented the method render, and in the method render, we have returned a kind of an HTML that incorporated inside it in curly braces a dynamic property, so a variable which points to some data. And React is ensuring us that it would know smartly to render this data, and when the data changes, it would know which parts of the screen, which part of the DOMs to dynamically change for us. So overall, this looks great because this means that you can just download such components from the internet and reuse them. The component that we have just seen was a stateless component. According to the documentation, if you want to have a stateful component, then what you need to do is, again, declare a class. For example, in this class, they declare a class named timer. It extends, again, react.component, but now in the constructor, they give it the props. Okay, so in addition to taking input data which you access via the prompt, you now have also access into the state, into the internal state data. So in this component, which is named timer, class timer extends react.component, constructor props, super props, this dot state equals second equals 0. So they have initialized it with the component, and now they have a method tick. The method tick is setting the state from the current state.seconds plus 1. And again, we have the render method. In this case, the render method is rendering. You say render method, open curly braces, return, start div, seconds, this.state.seconds. So in this case, you are referencing the state object. So now we know how to build a stateless and stateful components, and now we want to create our app. So what I do is, again, a class to do app extends react.component. We are again extending the component, and using the previous components that we used, we compose the application. We also declare the state in the app. So we had a component that referenced the state, and the state is declared on the app level. So we have some kind of a leak from the component to the app level. And then in the render method, we simply reference the above component that we reference just as any HTML tag. So if we declared already a component named to-do list, then we reference it as an HTML tag. So in the render of the application, which is itself a component, we do render function, return, start div, h3 to-do, and then to-do list. You actually write like an HTML element to-do list, and then items, you give it the state, this.state.items. On submit, this.handle submit, and handle submit is a standard JavaScript functions which would just update the state and the variables that you have. So we have defined multiple components. Each of them extended the React.component, and with the combination of JavaScript and the HTML, we have created components, composed them, and use them. So now they give another example of a component which uses external plugins, and this is where the real power comes, because many developers would create plugins, would create components, and you can just reuse them. This is the real power, the power of the community, because if so many people are using it, you are getting for free many components. So in this case, they are creating a class markdown editor, which extends React.component. And in the constructor of that class, they do this.md is assigned with new remarkable. Remarkable is an external component, which is like a markdown editor. So it's super simple here to use a markdown editor. You just define it on the constructor and then you just use it. And with this, you know the basics of React. In order to create a component, you create a class in JavaScript, extends React.component. You need to implement the render function. In the render function, you return a combination of HTML and JavaScript that references variables that you have. You can also create a stateful component. In stateful components, you reference, you access the internal state data via this.state, and again you use the render function in order to render it. An application is also a React.component. You extend again your app from React.component. You initialize all the functions and all the states that you have, and then again in the render function you just reference the other components and any HTML that you have. Very simple, and you can reuse external components just as you use your own internal components. You just define the class and reuse them. This was the basics of React in like 10 minutes. And now that we have understood basically how React works, how we could write simple components, let's dive a little bit deeper. So according to the documentation, the smallest React example would look like following. It does not have any component. It's just rendering some kind of an HTML. So even before writing any component, you could use some React code and you write this. React dom.render h1 hello world close tag h1 document.get element by id root. So it's simply displaying a heading saying hello world on the page. Now, when we printed this element in React, we used the format of start tag h1, hello world, and close tag h1. You could actually write some code that looks like const element h1 hello world and close tag h1. This syntax is not a string and not HTML. It's called JSX. The syntax is an extension to JavaScript. This is what is recommended to use in React. Why did they choose to use JSX? They are saying that React have noticed that you need somehow to couple the UI logic into your programming language, and this is what they did. They took the UI logic and coupled it to the actual rendering logic. So remember that created our original components with class welcome or class something extends React.component, but this is the ES6 class that we're using here to define a component. You could also define it with plain functions as was before ES6, which is function welcome receives prompts, and then you return something that looks like J6 h1 tag hello prompts.name and h1. The component themselves can reference other components. So in the component, when you define the function, then you could return not only some JSX HTML tags, you could refer also to other components via their tag name. So if we define the component that is named welcome, that in another component we could reference and just use the tag welcome. When you use the tag welcome in one component, it's referencing the other component that defined this tag. And for you to use some kind of state, and what you do is that instead of using this.props.date, for example, then you use this.state.date. Once you use this.state, you are referencing the state that you can actually change, and the component would be stateful, and you could save their stuff, and when you reuse them, they will remember their previous step. About handling events, then when you define your component, for example, class toggle extends react.component, and you can define the plain function, handle click. It would handle the click. Let's say it would change the state of whether the button is toggled on or off. And in your render, when you define some kind of an HTML element, for example, button, then you define as usual on click, and then with curly braces, this.handle click, and this would handle click would reference the standard function that you wrote above in the component. So in order to handle events, you define a function inside your component, and you reference it with standard JavaScript on click, call this function. And now the documentation moves on into guidelines on how to use React. So now that you know how to use components, how to use state and props, documentation first recommends you to break the UI into a component hierarchy. So if you have some kind of UI, then you break it into a search, into a search bar, a product table, product category row, and a product row, which are red rows. So you just split the UI into components. You identify the components and you create them as mocks, and you then arrange them into a component hierarchy. So at the top you have a filterable product table, and it has the internal component search bar product table, and a product table on its own is using the internal component of product category row and product row. So you have a hierarchy of products. The next step after you have built the component hierarchy is to build a static version of your React. What does it mean? It means you don't use state at all, because state is reserved for interactivity only. So you use only props, and you flow the data from top to bottom with the render. Now you have a non-interactive static version of your product in React. And now the next step is to identify the minimal but complete representation of the UI state. UI state is a complex thing. It would mess things up, so you want it to be minimal and complete. They have a few guidelines in order for you to identify what is a state and what not. For example, if it's passed from the parent via props, then it's not a state. If it remains unchanged over time, then it's probably not a state. And also, if you could compute it based on the other state or other props in the component, then it's not a state. So finally, they get to the conclusion that the state in their app where they had a table with a search bar is the search text that the user has entered, because it's changing and it's a state and you can compute it out of other states. And also the value of the checkbox if to select something or not. This is the minimal and the complete state that you should have. The next step after we have identified the state is to identify the components that are changing based on the state change. This is like the UI. We said that what is the state, that the search text, and if the user has checked something or not. And now we need to identify the components that should change. So we identify every component that renders something based on this state. We find a common owner component, a single component above all the components that needs the state in the hierarchy, and then it's either that the common component or another component higher up in the hierarchy should own this state. And if we can't find a component where it makes sense to own this state, then we create a new component solely for holding this state. So we try to put all this state somewhere in a common component, and then to propagate it to all the items that need it, and they would re-render the UI.